When I was just scrolling through Twitter the other day, minding my own business, something popped up out of the blue that I wasn't really expecting. It was regarding the PlayStation Vita. Sony's somewhat forgotten about commercial failure of a handheld device released in the States and Europe 10 years ago this week. But when I saw that tweet, the statements there about it being a failure were not what first popped into my mind. As I remembered the brilliant, plucky and sadly maligned handheld, I had a bit of a smile on my face. So for some background and context, the PS Vita was of course the successor to the PlayStation Portable, which in itself was somewhat successful. It may have not taken down the handheld giant, that was Nintendo, but it did compete pretty brilliantly. And it did well enough for Sony to be interested in a follow-up to the PSP. The new system was to try and match, or at least come close to the visuals offered by home systems of the time, which would be the PS3, Xbox 360 generation, and to provide some of the best visuals ever seen on a handheld. And at E3 2011, the PlayStation Vita was announced to the world. Now, in terms of games, the launch period of the Vita would actually be really pretty good. But sadly, it would also be its peak. Now, if you look at the Vita's launch slate of games, it would be the envy of pretty much any console. And I don't mean handheld, I mean home console too. There was a fully fledged Uncharted release, Wipeout 2048, Rayman, FIFA 12, and many more releases, all coming out as launch titles for the console. The Vita would actually go on and have more major releases throughout its first year: a Little Big Planet game, Gravity Rush, Persona 4, even a spin-off of main releases of Assassin's Creed and Call of Duty for that year, which would have been Assassin's Creed 3 Liberation and Black Ops Declassified. But despite these releases, and despite these quite high, big-end AAA names, by the end of the year, sales were low. Just 4 million units sold worldwide in its first 10 months. Now, sadly, thanks to the lack of sales during its first year, it was inevitable that the big publishers like Ubisoft and Activision weren't going to keep supporting the system much longer. Activision, in particular, pretty much pulled support completely, whereas Ubisoft and many others reduced the support quite significantly. Despite all this, 2013 did see some higher profile releases. Rayman Legends did make its way onto the Vita, and FIFA remains, despite being a complete copy and paste job for every year that it did remain. And to be honest with you, FIFA Legacy Editions and EA as a whole are subject for a future video, so we'll come to that then, but for now, back to the Vita. We also had Killzone Mercenary release in the last sort of quarter of the year, which was one of the more polished shooters and multiplayer experiences to release on the system, and Tearaway, which was created by the Little Big Planet makers media Molecule, which was an endearing little platformer, possibly one of the best major releases on the system as a whole. Despite this, the system did need a change in approach, and this would come in the shape of two things: indie developers and the upcoming PlayStation 4. Indie games would become the staple of the Vita for the rest of its existence. Smaller games such as Fez, Hotline Miami, Oli Oli, Spelunky all found success, as did the powerhouse that was Minecraft. Not really an indie game at the point that it went onto the Vita, but when it started it was, so I felt like it was worth adding to the list there. Indie developers continued to support the system even after PlayStation and Sony had gave up on it from a game development point of view in 2015. Indie games continued to be made for the system right up until it finally got pulled for good. But back the truck up again to 2013-14. Now, the second part in the change of approach consisted of the PS4. The Vita was essentially being positioned as a side tool to the PS4. It could be used as a second screen, or perhaps more importantly, used for remote play. Now, it's another sort of sad indictment, similar to the fact that the launch of the Vita was probably the best of it got. And another one of the best parts of the Vita was sadly to do with the main home system. However, that being said, the remote play for the PS4 was brilliant. It worked far better than it ever did for the PS3. It was great to be able to take your PS4 games into other rooms or keep playing when the TV was in use, and it worked very seamlessly. Like I say, it was much better than the option we had for the PS3's remote play. And to be honest with you, through that period of the PS4, the PS Vita, in my case at least, probably got more use out of being a second controller as it was for a PS4 than it did being its own console. Now, sort of from 2016 onwards, there was very little to talk about when it came to the Vita. Indie developers still utilised it, using it to get their games out there to the world, maybe in the hope of it going further. There was still a passionate, albeit relatively small fan base. However, Sony had long since stopped caring. Production of Vita hardware stopped in 2019. Sony nearly pulled the plug on the store last year, along with the PS3 store. However, they did a U-turn after a little bit of backlash. However, one would imagine it is only a matter of time before they put the lights out on the Vita for good. Now, the obvious place to start when it comes to what went wrong for Sony's handheld would be the rise of smartphones. During the time of the Vita, the amount of smartphones in use was going up all the time, and nowadays basically everyone has one. Through the Vita's lifespan, they also got more powerful and more capable, and with a massively large potential player base, games stood more chance of success on there than on a niche handheld device. Even Nintendo, the kings of handheld with their DS's and 3DS's, have been impacted by this. Both Sony and Nintendo have either looked at getting their games on mobile or have got them on mobile. However, the use of mobile phones is an excuse I'm not particularly happy with. Ultimately, Sony did a lot of damage to their system, and the rise of smartphones is a bit of a cop-out. There was, of course, the price point at the time of launch. It was incredibly steep, especially compared to the 3DS. This inevitably had to come down, but by 2013, when the price did come down a bit, the system was already past its peak, as we went on about earlier. But the system wasn't the main issue in this regard. The memory cards were extortionate. Even now, on a second-hand site, if the 32GB is 50 quid, the 64 is 80. You would have to spend $250 on the device. Games were often around 40 to 50. And to store them, you need memory cards, which, let's face it, you can't just cope with the 4GB, which was the cheapest option. It would never hold out for long. Sony also had a complete lack of care for it. Past 2012, the system to them seemed already consigned to failure. The marketing was poor, they didn't get it out there enough. They gave up on it long before many others did. With no plans for any future handheld device and the market not looking like it's going to head in that direction anytime soon, Sony's portable legacy will sadly not be anything to do with the PSP success, but it will be forever tarnished by what they did with the Vita. But we should not remember the system for that. Let's remember it for managing to bridge the gap between handheld and home consoles more than any other device had. Let's remember it for some quality games, both bigger titles and in the form of indies, that were made and played by those that continued to back the system, even when those who made it had given up the ghost. Let's remember it for the weird, slightly inefficient but incredibly welcoming bubble UI. The PS Vita was powerful. It was almost ahead of its time, with some specs that even rival the new Switch now. It will always be up there for me as a console, as a whole, and one that I will be glad to go back to every now and then. One of the most, possibly the most underrated console there has ever been, even underrated by the people that created it. Here's hoping that in another 10 years' time there are people out there still championing the wonderful little PlayStation Vita.